First of all, though, perhaps I should just make a particular welcome to railway enthusiasts who I know have come along in numbers tonight, and we're certainly pleased to see you here, and you're welcome, to, of course, to come to every meeting of the Historical Society, which are held here on the first Friday of each month. So please don't make this the only occasion, but I'm sure that John's lecture is going to be well worthwhile hearing, and hopefully we'll start you off on something great. John Evans is our guest speaker. He's had a 34-year career spanning transport, travel and tourism, and started in 1967 with the former South Australian Railways. He currently works in the South Australian Tourism Commission as Manager of Executive Services. His work includes policy formulation and strategic transport initiatives like the Barossa Bird tourist train development. John's passion for trains spans more than 40 years. In the 1950s, holidays at his grandparents' house alongside the main line at Hawthorn started an absorbing interest in the railways and continues to this day. His first rail enthusiast trip was the memorable last run to Mount Pleasant behind Mikado 706 back in March 1963. Tonight, John turns the clock right back to nearly 150 years and looks at the evolution of the railway station in all parts of South Australia and in the Northern Territory, and from the Port Adelaide line in 1856 to the Keswick terminal in 1984. Please make welcome John Evans.
Thank you, Morris, and good evening, everybody. I hope that what I have to share with you tonight either brings back memories, sparks recollections, or in fact introduces you to some aspect of railway activity in this state and the Northern Territory, the like of which sadly we will never see again. I started in the job in the railways in 1967, and I'm delighted to renewed acquaintance tonight with someone whom I worked with, not perhaps directly, but this person's name bobbed up in all manner of places, and I'm referring to Ron Grant. Ron, I still have certificates that you signed, signing your life away. Doug Fitzgerald was my lecturer, and I had some delightful times in Tin Town alongside the banks of the River Torrens studying my railway procedures. But it was an era, as I said, we won't see again. 100 years ago, probably on a balmy night like we're enjoying here this evening, there were countless railway families all over the state, from Carrickey to Coburn, from Mount Gambier to Stevenage, from Port Lincoln to Paratoo. Not just one family, but in some settlements, whole numbers of people. They almost formed a small community in their own right. They had wives, they had children, sometimes large families in fact. And these people were carving a career in the railways as porters, as clerks, as station masters, as gangers and fettlers and pumpers and fitters, and the list of job descriptions was just endless. At its peak, the South Australian Railways alone employed over 10,000 people. Today, the railways are run by a handful, a fraction of that particular number. Towns that in the past boasted quite large and commodious railway stations are today at best names on a map, and in many cases are no more. Absolutely not. Unless you knew the location of some of these places, one of which we'll see here tonight, you just wouldn't realise that at one point in time there had been a station supported by the various members of the staff that made up the railway presence in that place. In the last 20 years we've seen the gradual decline and withdrawal of staff throughout the state. Lines have closed. And the effect on the town community of the withdrawal of those railway pay packs has been phenomenal. There are towns still in recovery mode. Peterborough, Salem Bend, Karoonda, Allawoona, Wandoo, all manner of places. Some of these names you might be hearing for the first time tonight, and I hope to introduce you to some places for the like of which you may never ever have heard of, didn't even know a railway went there. Certainly doesn't anymore. We'll show you a place that the railway stopped within 4 miles of the River Murray. You think today, why did that railway not go to the river's edge and tap into the river traffic? It stopped in the middle of nowhere within 4 miles of Marook. The story I want to impart tonight is certainly in part about the railway architecture, how the station's changed and evolved over time. And in this, there'll be a reflection, in fact, of the state's prosperity from the heady days in the early stages to the depths of depression in some decades, a little bit of a boost and revitalisation again, only to slip back in the following decade. We're going to take it in decades from the 1850s through to the 1980s. I hope what I'm going to share with you tonight is representative of what we're talking about. In looking at putting the finishing touches to this talk last night, I had to cull so much material. I've actually got far more here than I could probably share with you in a reasonable amount of time. In terms of going through the decades, as you can see here, everyone, the first 3 decades, the first 30 years, we saw a gradual expansion of railways. In the 1850s, and in some respects I suppose I'm excluding the tramway which ran between Goolwa, Port Elliot and eventually to Victor Harbour. The first railway line of any serious note was Adelaide to Port Adelaide in 1856. But it wasn't long before lines were snaking northward up to Smithfield and Gawler, and in the very earliest stages Yakla Jail was already served, what was in the old days called Stockade, which is today Yakla Jail. Beyond Gawler, the next line was to Kapunda in 1860 to tap into the copper mine, and also to provide a railhead to the activity in Burra, even at that early stage. In the early 1860s, John McGill Stewart, in fact, the last leg of his return journey from his success in getting through to Northern Australia, was to take the train from Kapunda to Adelaide, after having had an incredible bender in the John Franklin Hotel in Kapunda itself. Good indeed. The others, as you can see there, everyone, of course, there was activity down south, and the line gradually pushed forward to Tarlee. And in those early stages, this is what, in 1860, there wasn't much on the map. Over the next few minutes or so, we're going to actually fill this map. Every 10 years, we will progressively expand the network that was the old South Australian Railway. So as you can see, in 1860, we have a line to Port Adelaide, we have a line heading north up to Gawler, full stop. We have the first Adelaide station, although this was taken in 1870. This is North Terrace. Look at this wag here on the right, leaning up against the lamppost. It's a delightful shot. What's worth pointing out is the unmistakable English appearance in the early stages of railway architecture in this state. This is typically English. Stone buildings, very solid as you can see. There's a signal cabin with Adelaide goods shed, sheds over here. In the background, can you see the framework? The first stage is Parliament House on North Terrace in its early stages of construction. A great deal of activity, as you can see, but the railway rolling stock compared to today's standard on a very small scale. Very, very small scale, but unmistakably English. On the port line, although this was taken in the early 1900s, here's Bowden Railway Station. Very solid looking building. The gooseneck lamps you can see here. The railway overpass, the pedestrian bridge that graced so many stations on lines around Adelaide. And the number of staff. This was the era of labour-intensive activity. There was a job for everyone, a job for life in the railways, virtually up until probably the 1960s and 70s. A wonderful glimpse of Adelaide Past, everyone. Who here can remember the wonderful Port Dock Railway Station? Beautiful Italianate design, beautifully designed and built too, built to last. Unfortunately it came down. In this day and age, I'm sure that wouldn't be allowed to happen. A building of that nature and quality and uniqueness would in fact be allowed to stand. This was also the era, if you look behind you, this is the era of massive canopies. Even though this was an era of steam engines, they had these canopies, very English style. You think of York, think of Newcastle in the UK, even to this day they have canopies. And we can't get more English than this, can we? This is Glanville in 1910. And you swear that was something out of the British Isles, wouldn't you? Look at the wonderful woodwork, the finials here on top of the oil lamp, the pedestrian overbridge, the wooden planking on the platform, not solid but constructed of timber. Unusually perhaps in some respects, and we'll see this in just a moment, South Australia is not renowned for timber being used as a building medium in housing and so forth, and yet the railways in various places did use timber quite a lot. Our first major station north of Adelaide. Hasn't changed very much, has it? This is Gawler. Here's your stone goods shed on the right. You have a signal cabin in the distance, and there's that canopy again over part of the platform, what we call the island platform at Gawler. as substantially as it is today, as it was in 1857. And a little further to the north, Kapunda. Further out, there you go, 1 horsepower. It didn't take very long for the authorities perhaps to start to build line-side structures in a more economical fashion. This was in fact as Hamley Bridge in the 1870s. The horse in this case would be used for shunting rather than out on the main track. But it's interesting to note, and there's a couple of photos a bit later on overhead, horse shunting took place in this state in some major station yards up until 1963. Kapunda and Burra were the last places to use horses to shunt railway rolling stock around the yard. They were used in areas where it was a very complicated yard. Kapunda particularly was a very complicated yard, especially to work in at night. It was just a nightmare for staff, and so horses were used. In 1870 the line was pushing northward, and here we have the earliest part of the Riverton railway station. Riverton is probably one of the most substantially built stations that we have here in the States to this day. Remarkable building for its time, but already the era of the railway refreshment room had come into being, and stations that had substantial structures, generally speaking, owed that to either their prominence as a railway centre and or the fact that they provided refreshments for passengers. Bear in mind, up until the 1950s, rail was the great people mover for decade after decade. Another glimpse of Riverton. I put this in just to demonstrate the substantial nature of the buildings. Of the buildings that you see in that frame, there's only basically two. There's the station proper and what was an engine shed, a building just sitting in there. The other buildings regrettably gone. But in its day, as you can see, here was a very substantial country station in South Australia. Another, a little later on, again further extensions beyond the earlier part that we saw. This was the refreshment area. In 1921, the Broken Hill Express, as it did every morning that it ran, stopped at Riverton for refreshments. Shots rang out, and Australia had its first, and there's only been two, but this was the first of two political assassinations in Australian history. The member for Broken Hill, Percy Brookfield, stepped forward to try and disarm the fellow with a gun and was shot and subsequently died. To this day, if you know and look closely, you'll see the ricochet where the bullets hit the building itself during this mad melee. If you're ever at Riverton, it's a wonderful gallery, tea rooms and a bed and breakfast these days. And if you ask the people nicely, they'll show you the ricochet, the results of that political assassination back in 1921. By 1870, the line had reached Burra. Again, there's that canopy, put up at extraordinary expense. One wonders why. What purpose did it serve, really, except to provide shelter for a limited amount of time for a limited number of people. But this is the scale on which these sort of major stations were built. It's ironic that the line reached Burra virtually just as the mines petered out. Canopies are in abundance. This is a wonderfully evocative shot of the Melbourne intercolonial train about to leave Adelaide in the early part of the 1900s. Again, a canopy effect is there, and here's a wonderful train drawn by two locomotives, an RX leading and a smaller boilered R-class just following behind. At the start of 1880, that's the route that we basically have. We've got lines to the north of Adelaide reaching as far north as Hallett by this stage, and we start to see some lines moving in from the coast, from Wallaroo and also from Port Pirie heading east, and also down here from Kingston across to Narracourt. These lines are built to the narrower 3'6" gauge, built as an economy measure back in those early days. And although the lines haven't linked up yet, we already have two railway gauges in South Australia, to be joined by a third in the early part of the 20th century. Now we come to the first decade of incredible boom. Something like, let me have a look here, I'll get the exact figure, in the 1880s, we see nearly 1,200 miles of new track opened in 10 years in South Australia. and 146 miles in the Northern Territory. This is the decade in which the line is built from Palmerston, now known as Darwin, down to Pine Creek. Again, lines push in, they go inland. The Great Northern Line has already started in the late 1870s, heading for Horn and now up to Hawker, up to Beltana, and ultimately up to Farina and Maree. Lines head south, and again we have the substantial line built from the hill, through the hills to the border at Bordertown and Surbiton, and the line from Peterborough through Port Pirie up to Coburn, connecting with the Silverton Tramway, and linking of course with Broken Hill and the fabulous mines. And so by 1890 we've jumped to this sort of a network. We're linked with Melbourne, we're linked with Broken Hill. We've got a network of lines, we've linked with Morgan as well. We're one of the first enterprising governments to see the potential of the River Murray traffic, and so we get a line very quickly up to Morgan, about 105 miles northeast of Adelaide. The English influence continues. There's a wonderfully elaborate Mount Barker junction. It's got everything, hasn't it? There's signals, platforms, a signal box just over here, an engine shed, a turntable. Imagine the number of staff that a place like this would have boasted back in those days. Mount Barker closed as a bottom grade station, class 7 station, I think, John, from memory. Back in the latter years, it was little more than a signal box in its latter years. On the line to Broken Hill, again we see the rise in wooden structures. Unfortunately no more, but this is Kaltowie, between Jamestown and Gladstone up in our state's mid-north. Again, a wooden station building, and we'll have a look at a plan now to give you an idea of what accommodation is provided for, the station master. This area here was the accommodation for the station master and his family. Bear in mind that in these early days there was probably no power, there was no running water, foodstuffs, all the things that we tend to take for granted was still a struggle for these people, and yet living as they did by a railway line, it gave them that link, I suppose, with civilisation that people living further out didn't enjoy necessarily. There was the ubiquitous ladies' waiting room. There was always this tendency of segregation of the genders, and so ladies always seem to have an area with a little more privacy, perhaps appropriately for the era than us gents did. We were usually out in the open or in some open area. That was the theory, at least. And there was always a porter's room attached, where there'd be all sorts of effects left. There'd be sometimes a lamp room. There were extraordinary instructions issued for the lighting and extinguishing of lamps at dusk and at sunrise. It makes another story in itself for another occasion. The earliest railway station at Quorn was also a wooden construction. We'll have a look at the current building in just a moment. Again, this is a wonderful shot. There's two what we call Y-class locomotives seen in the picture. One with quite a long string of livestock trucks, which really were the mainstay of the line, the Great Northern Line to Eden at Atta. Without livestock traffic, this line would have been an even bigger loss maker than it was pretty well throughout its whole life. And getting up towards the border, we stay with the timber theme, the Coburn. Not much architectural merit in that, is there? Pretty standard configuration. Your offices were in this area here. There was usually a ticket window. There was a waiting room area here, both open and partly enclosed, and a porter's area, and a good old dunny on the side here. Again, there were very detailed instructions for the removal of night soil. You drew the short straw if you got that job, I can assure you. But we also see during the 1880s the advent of a wonderful style of building which was common throughout South Australia. I'm not quite sure who we attribute it to. It's often ascribed to be, it comes under the label of Walker and Swan, who were railway contractors during this era of construction throughout the state. But this very solid style of building that incorporated everything in terms of the station office, accommodation for the station master and his family, and waiting facilities and so forth, was all under this roof. It's probably testimony that so many of these buildings survive today in a variety of forms, from private residences to even a bed and breakfast. This is a delightful shot taken at Laura in 1980, up in the mid-north. Today this station is a private residence. You'll find these stations to this day as close as Mitcham, Blackwood, Aldgate, Mount Lofty, Mount Barker, South Alban, Nairn, Beltanner, that's the furthest north. You'll get Hawker, Orroroo, Crystal Brook in the old days, Peterborough, Karawi. This particular style of building just seemed to be everywhere at major places, and some minor ones too. There's a delightful bed and breakfast at a little place called Bruce, which is just out of corner. I don't know if anyone enjoyed the hospitality of Tony and Maggie Green Jones. If you haven't, and you really want to, I guess, recreate an era that's gone. Your check is in the mail to me later, I take it. But if you really want to, I can remember as a youngster travelling past in trains, past a deserted ruin really, with a pepper tree growing out through the roof. And yet, who would have guessed that 35 years later I was enjoying their hospitality, staying under the roof of the Bruce railway station. Built on the scale that it was, by the way, because their expectations that a branch line would be built from Bruce across to Wilmington, but they'd never eventuated. And this also is a wonderfully evocative shot at Carrington. Look at that wonderful Model T in the foreground. Again, I said earlier, and I guess this will be a recurring theme, that railways were the great people movers of the day. The vehicles and the roads just weren't the equal of trains in this era. Everything and everyone travelled by train, from homing pigeons. You look at wicker baskets here that probably might have had some either washing or dry cleaning, something heading perhaps further down the track to be done and pressed in some way and returned. Parcels, all manner of things travelled in the breakvans and in the freight trains. Carrington Station today is a private residence, beautifully maintained. Curiously, the station is 2 miles from the township. Further to the north, they were playing tennis in Hergot Springs. I think it's a long way from the nearest tennis court with a tennis racket there and a bowler hat. Prior to World War I, Hergot Springs was the name, as you can see, and of course it was renamed Maree. And again, this is a good example of a wooden building in a remote location, built as perhaps a bit of an economy measure. But again, look at this wonderful woodwork. Imagine the labour that would have gone into this dovetailing here. But a beautiful photograph. Again, an era that we won't see again. Fortunately, some buildings do remain and are preserved. This is Manor Hill, sort of midway between Peterborough and Coburn. Built on this scale because, again, similar to Riverton, this was a refreshment stop. Trains would stop for anything between 8 and 15 minutes, so it was a bit of a race to get in, get a pie, a tea or whatever, and get out and get on the train again. You had to be pretty quick, but they did in their day serve some delightful meals, proper meals. You could have all variety of things, whatever you had, no matter what you had, it was a shilling. Take it or leave it. After the heady days of the 1880s, we suddenly come to a screaming halt in the 1890s. And of course, Australia was in the grip of a depression. And so literally overnight, railway construction dried up. During this whole decade of the 1890s, only 100 new miles of railway was open to traffic. It was as if we went to sleep. One railhead was reached, however, in 1891, pushing up from Hergot Springs and Warriner, Udnadatta. This proved to be the most substantial building, in effect, north of Port Augusta. The station was the wooden part you see here on the right. The station master's residence was the stone. It exists to this day. It's a museum today, and it's still a wonderful building, set in splendid isolation in Udnadatta. At a time when the GAN, or even before the GAN, the Udnadatta Mixed, it was known as, it ran once a fortnight. You didn't want to miss it. Had a long wait for the next time. The train has just arrived in Udnadatta, and probably half, if not the whole town, has turned out to greet some arriving personage at Udnadatta. It's a wonderful photograph. And despite the fact that it was the terminus and there was such a limited train service, it had a signal. One can only imagine the station master sending the porter down to put the signal to proceed, to allow the one train a fortnight to come in. The fledgling state government here in South Australia was doing the amazing. and constructing a line from Palmerston, as it was in those days, south to tap into the goldfields around Grove Hill and Pine Creek. And although this was taken a little later, this was taken in the 1930s. There was one train a week regularly in these days, from Darwin down to Birdham, known as Leaping Lena. And you see the train arriving back into Darwin from the south. Again, probably half the population are there to meet and greet the train. Beautiful photograph. On top of the hill, the station master's house. Didn't quite survive the cyclone in 74. By ship, everything was taken by ship around to Palmerston, put together. There were workshops that variously called the 2.5 mile or Parap. They were put together there and basically ran as a separate enterprise until the Commonwealth took over in the early part of the 20th century. Again, I just put this in just to give an indication of the architectural, the drawings that were done for stations on the line. There were some very substantial buildings put up in places like Adelaide River, slightly bigger than the normal because, again, this was a refreshment station. The speed of train travel in these days was something average between 12 and 20 miles an hour. Mark Twain, when he visited South Australia in 1897, remarked at the slowness and suggested that a cow catch should be put on the rear of all trains. Such was the snail-like progress that trains took, and there was complete disregard for anything approaching a timetable. In the 1890s, there was some narrow gauge track built, particularly up to Gladstone, and this is Brinkworth Station. It still exists, but only just. It's one of those stations in splendid decay, unfortunately, a little bit like Burra and other stations in the country. This was taken in 1968 and just shows here Brinkworth changed to Snowtown, Red Hill and Moonta lines. A little further to the north, again another delightful example of architecture of the 1890s, wood again, and again a station that is no more. This is Georgetown, just south of Gladstone. And in its latter years it was what we call a Class 7 station, which again is the bottom of the run. In the late 1890s, look at this beautiful stone architecture, everyone. This is Stockport Station between Hamley Bridge and Tarlee. Stations of this kind were built all the way along the line, and again, as you can see, it's to a very high standard, beautiful quality of workmanship, without any doubt at all. Alas, today, Manura, which is a sister station, looks like this back in January. It's very sad to see, I guess, the decline and decay of so many country stations that in their day were significant assets to that community. The early 1900s, we see the start of lines over on Eyre Peninsula, the famed Port Lincoln division. Probably one of those, even to this day, that is only one of the few divisions that actually paid its way with the traffic that it hauled superphosphate and grain. A very commodious wooden station building at Cummins. Cummins was a major crewing and a barracks base, and at one time had extensive locomotive workshops, in fact, in Cummins. And again, probably fairly typical of other station buildings over on the west coast. By contrast, you might find yourself waiting for a train here at Wanilla. I think it was ladies to the left and gents to the right if you had that call of nature. There wasn't too much in the way of privacy there. And again, a lot of secondary stations and minor halts and sidings along the way would boast little more than that. The Murray Mallee, the west coast and other parts, that was in fact the standard item of equipment or shelter provided for anyone waiting for a train. The first sign out of the Murray Mallee was to Pinaroo in 1906. It created Tailem Bend as a junction for the first time. And again we have, I'm sure you all know, that wonderful Murray Mallee style of farmhouse with a veranda on all four sides, designed with the extremes of temperature of weather in mind. The stations were no different, albeit on a smaller scale. This is at Lameroo. This in fact is taken quite recently. Quite an unusual photograph because this was at the time of gauge standardisation between Adelaide and Melbourne in 1995. And whilst that work was taking place, interstate freight trains were rerouted via Ogun in Victoria through Pinaroo to Tailem Bend. So this particular section of track enjoyed a very heady existence for albeit a few weeks with these big interstate freight trains thundering, well, not so much thundering, I probably did about 30 or 40 kilometres an hour. And down south, with our horses hunting again. This is at Millicent in the 1950s. And I've included this partly to just show you a delightful shot of an idyllic station setting before the gauge was widened from 3'6" to 5'3" back in the mid-50s. And the station building here, quite substantial, quite large. You'll find them today still at Millicent, at Pinaroo, and at Thevenard. You'll find that style of station building. In 1910, as you can see, we had our line out to Pinaroo, we had a line up to Cummins. And now we come to the other great burst of railway activity in South Australia. Paradoxically, perhaps, this took place at the height of the First World War. There were more railway miles laid than at any other time, particularly taking into account the line from Port Augusta across to Kalgoorlie in the west. That alone was 1,108 miles. And there was nearly 1,000 miles of other track constructed between 1910 and 1919. And this was the era, along with the 20s as we'll see in a moment, where there were an appallingly high number of lines built A, to nowhere, B, to serve no purpose, and C, never came anywhere remotely close to paying their way, not even the interest on the loan money. Key among these was the line from Yalana to Mount Hope. At its peak, Mount Hope boasted one train a fortnight. The maximum speed on the line was 10 miles an hour, leaving Yalana. The crew working this particular train once a fortnight had to draw extra stores from Port Lincoln in case they came off the track. They were literally on their own when they left Yalana on the main line. And there is a list that exists to this day in the working timetable that lists all the extra items that crews working to Mount Hope will take with them in the event of derailment. You basically had to get yourself out and back by whatever means, and derailments were many. Other lines pushed out into the Murray Mallee to unlikely places like Pedinga, Yinkanny, Waikerie, Loxton, Paringa, and so the list goes on. With one exception perhaps, they all served little purpose, saw little traffic, but were built on the promise that landholders along the way would in fact patronise the railways. In fact didn't, certainly not to the extent that was required to make them pay. Even the Wollonga line, which was built in around 1915, was built on the same principle and never even looked like paying its way. The line to Clare and Spalding was in much the same sort of position. Now Pleasant and Sedan, we marvel at the fact that the line was ever built at Sedan. We really do. Even though today it still serves its purpose, it's a very important grain retrieval point at Appamar. In amongst the standard style of buildings that were constructed throughout the railway's time, there were some magnificent exceptions. And one of those was Quorn. The Quorn station was built in 1916 to a unique style. Cape Dutch, it's almost something that comes out of South Africa. You could see this station in the Cape Colony, I'm sure. But built it was at Quorn. It survives to this day. This particular photograph was taken in 1957, the first occasion of a regular rail car working from Tarawi through to Quorn. I wanted you to remember 1958, a film was made called The Sundowners. Peter Ustinov, Robert Mitchum and Deborah Carr. A train was sent specifically from Peterborough to Quorn to feature in that movie. If you haven't seen it for a while, get the movie out and look out for the Quorn railway station and the steam train. The station was called Corndilla. It was very much in this sort of state of sort of disrepair and a rundown effect. But a wonderful movie and some great scenes in and around Quorn itself. So I commend that to you, everyone. The Sundowners. Filmed mainly in South Australia, but also a little bit in New South Wales. But some wonderful scenes in the Southern Flinders particularly. The locomotive that featured in that is now part of the display in Peterborough. It's only just been put into position, a Y-class in fact. The crew of that particular train, one of the treasures that he kept was a signed autograph photograph from Deborah Carr on the locomotive. Quorn Railway Station today, everyone. It's been beautifully restored and of course it's home headquarters today to today's very successful Victory Railway. A good example of a station that has been given new life. In the 1910s, we had this amazing architectural style that came from nowhere, termed Queen Anne. It actually, I think, has, I don't know, fellows, whether you think or not, but to me it has a very much an American influence, which we're going to see in a moment in the 1920s. But these enormous station buildings went up in a very limited number of locations throughout South Australia. Apart from Tailem Bend, you'll find today this style of building at Bordertown, at Penola, surprisingly. No one can tell me why a station this size was built for Penola. And the other two that spring to mind are Wallaroo and Moonta, where the same style of building will be found today. Generally speaking, far in excess of any known or expected traffic requirements. This is Moonta railway station back in the late 1960s, with the school rail car having just arrived from Sedina and Wallaroo. Today it serves as an information centre being restored to a pristine condition. At around this time we saw this style of station waiting area being put up. This is Hawthorn, with a passenger train from Tailem Bend just about to go past. You were able to find this style of waiting area at unlikely places such as Morphett Vale and Seven Hill up in the Clear Valley. Hilltown, you'd find this style of building, apart from around suburban Adelaide. Wooden buildings reached their zenith at places like Truro, and this particularly Mount Pleasant. As Morris said in his introduction, I was privileged to be on the last train to Mount Pleasant in 1963. It was a wonderful afternoon, never forgotten it. And I had the privilege of, as I said, riding a train to this unlikely destination in the Adelaide Hills. You look at it today and you can't work out how or why they put a 51-mile railway line to a place that's only 30 miles direct from Adelaide. A little bit like Victor Harbour. Victor Harbour's 81 miles by rail, 50 by road. Alas, it's no more, but back in the 1950s, that's what the Mount Pleasant railway station looked like. On the Sedan line, we see unusually the station building set back from the platform, not on the platform itself, but actually set back at ground level. Appamurra is just between Palmer and Mannum. For those of you who know the Mannum Road, now a very big grain retrieval point and gets a lot of regular trains, ironically. Up until the 1950s, Appamurra boasted a station master. You look at the place today and you just marvel and wonder what that station master did between weekly trains. And Ron Grant, I'm sure, may remember one of the last station masters was a chap known as Max Eistedt, who was a train controller, one of my mentors back in the 60s. Little exceptions to the rule continued to bob up in the late 1910s. This is at Oodlawirra. The Bullaroo Centre boasted a similar style of station, quite a substantial stone and brick building, often occupying the same railway line as wooden buildings elsewhere, and yet occasionally these stone buildings would intervene. Elsewhere, we mustn't forget here in South Australia, of course, that we hosted Commonwealth Railway. And 1913 saw the advent of the start of the construction of the massive transcontinental railway line across to the west. And during this period, the wonderful Port Augusta station came into being. Early photographs of this area show that, in fact, what happened, they actually excavated through a giant sandhill in the heart of Port Augusta to create level ground and to build the station that is there to this day. Later in the year, it will be host to, of course, the resumption by Pitchirichi of narrow gauge train services from Port Augusta through Pitchirichi Pass to Cairns. Elsewhere on the line, this is a style of building that bobbed up all over the place. The gentleman in the photograph is Rolly Sinclair. He's ruefully contemplating his future. He's been told he hasn't got a job anymore at Tarcoola. Rolly still lives in Tarcoola, I might add. He was one of the last station masters to work there up until early 1990s. Elsewhere, in places like, you might recall the earlier Hurdock Springs photograph, this is Maree. The Commonwealth Railways did a wonderful job in building very substantial, solid, poured concrete buildings. They really were designed to last and provide very good insulation. There was, as you can see, that large veranda type of overhang designed to provide shade to the people working in places like Maree together and so forth. By 1920, look at how our network has developed from back in the 1850s and 60s. We have lines that are now going everywhere, literally, all over. But there's still more to come. The 1920s sees the last burst of railway construction in South Australia. We see lines that have been started in the previous decade move on to their destination, Clare to Spalding, Long Plains through the north up to Snowtown and Red Hill. We see another of these crazy lines built from Wanby to Yincanning. And this is a line that stops 4 miles short of the River Murray. We see other curious lines like Thumbunga to Lochiel. You probably all know where Lochiel is on the main road up through to Crystal Brook and beyond. But Thumbunga perhaps may not be as well known to folks here. We see the bridging of the River Murray at Taringa, enabling a link to be made with Renmark, and then on to Barmera. You've got this curious dogleg where the line basically goes back on itself. If you were travelling from Adelaide to Barmera, it literally took you all day, the better part of over 12 hours to travel up there. To the north, of course, the place that has been the terminus for so many years ceased to be that, and of course the line to Alice Springs went through Rumballara up to Central Australia. Coming to the south, the Pine Creek line had pushed south to a place called the Mungalan on the northern banks of the Katherine River. The Katherine was eventually bridged. It was the biggest single engineering project that the Territory had seen at that time, and the line eventually reached Burdham in 1929. There was actually earthworks done in place. If you know where to look, you can see them to this day as far south as Daly Waters. But again, depression set in and the line was never built. Port Pirie was reached in 1937, both from the south and the north, and for the first time in the history of the world we had not one but two but three railway gauges at the same place. Port Pirie was unique until 1970 as boasting 3 gauges. It was a yardmaster's absolute nightmare. One of the buildings he causes to have built is the Port Lincoln railway station. No platform. Most narrow gauge stations didn't boast a platform. The carriages themselves had little steps, as you can see here. Again, as an economy measure as well, but this is a station built in 1924 during the Webb era. Apart from the Adelaide station, perhaps the best other example that's still around today, and I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you, the Victor Harbour Railway Station. This is American to a T, plus a platform, admittedly, which Americans weren't renowned for, but this is an American style of railway station plucked out of the US in the 1920s. In 1926, the railways dispatched their photographer down to Victor Harbour to take a whole host of photographs. And this is just one he took on this day of the station from various angles. There's recently been some restoration done to the station, and there's going to be, I think, a little bit more done as well to make sure that it continues to serve the cockle train and steam ranger for many years to come. The zenith of Webb's achievement, however, was the Adelaide Railway Station. And I've included this over here just to give you a contrast between before and after. This is a building allegedly built without formal approval. We've always maintained that the docket that contained the approval had been inadvertently and inexplicably mislaid. To this day, no one knows, indeed, whether in fact it did have formal sign-off, but built it was. A massive achievement for the day back in the 20s, and of course it stands today as a testament to W.A. Webb, a most amazing man. If you get an opportunity, there is a book in existence by Dr. Rhys Jennings about the social history and geography. It's a wonderful read about Webb. I've included this, again it's taken in the 1920s, and this is a wonderful leisurely style of rail travel. This is the grounds of the Mount Barker station, another refreshment room. Now ladies, wouldn't you be delighted to sit down and enjoy partake tea? And then about 11 o'clock in the morning, you've been on the train for an hour and a half or so out of Adelaide, so it's time for refreshment. And you'd be ushered out, sat down with tablecloths, lovely rosewood chairs, and you'd enjoy a few minutes in the grounds of the Mount Barker station. Wonderful. Elsewhere, we had very austere, we're back to wooden buildings again here in the 1920s. This is the former station of Virginia. Now no more. The trains are all through here at 115 or more kilometres an hour these days. There is nothing to indicate where Virginia station really was. And now we come to a wonderful, it's fresh out of a cartoon. The amazing thing is this was occupied by a station master until 1971. And this was not a bottom of the... This was a Class 6 station, not Class 7. You jumped the grade if you went to Yen Canning. The last station master, John Shell, gratefully departed in 1971 when the line closed. Thank goodness this station has been preserved in perpetuity. You'll find it today in the Loxton Historical Village, in Loxton, of course, alongside a wonderful RX locomotive number 55. As I said earlier, this is the point, this is the terminus that was within 4 miles of the River Murray that never made it. The vehicle here on the left is known as the comma car, a bright orange coloured vehicle that was used to run a mail and small parcel service on lines radiating out from Taroonda. We've now seen the last of railway construction of any great extent. It slows right down from this point, from the 1920s. There virtually is no more. Just little lines here and there. A few extensions are put in. Radium Hill gets its own line of 11 miles in length. Port Stanback gets a railway line. Tonsley gets a railway line. In the 1970s we see the coming of the standard gauge as we know it today. I've included this. This is taken in the early 1950s. I don't know if anyone, I'm sure there are people who live in this area. How times have changed. Isn't it remarkable? It's taken from the main road bridge, looking towards Belair, because all this area here is now occupied by housing development. It's been established over many years. But this was an era where you had trains running to Belair and Bridgewater. As you can see, a steam locomotive with a driver, a fireman, a guard, and 2 carriages. An economically suicidal basis for working at the best of times. There was no platform, but perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, some of you may remember this, what they call a step-down type facility. You literally had to go up a series of steps to get onto the carriage platform proper. There was no proper platform in place as such. Quite amazing. And these were dotted all over. Eventually, of course, they were replaced by platforms. 1955 saw the peak number of railway miles open in South Australia. The lines reached literally everywhere, with perhaps the notable exception of York Peninsula. Even Kangaroo Island boasted its own small railway line from Muston to Salt Lake, just inland, run with steam locomotives and motor traction. The aim in many respects was for the railway to be for the farmer to be no more than 20 miles from the rail line and desirably the nearest railway siding. And in terms of settled areas, that was pretty much what the railways achieved during that particular time. The 1950s, as well as the 1920s, saw a number of lines widen from narrow gauge to the 5'3", the broad gauge. In the 1920s, during Webb's era, he widened what had been known as the Western Division, and this was the area from Hamley Bridge to Balaclava, Port Wakefield to Wallaroo and Moonta, from Kadina across to Brinkworth, and from Balaclava to Gladstone. All those lines were widened from 3'6" to 5'3". And the same thing happened in the southeast in the 1950s. The line from Wolseley to Mount Gambier to Milliston and to Kingston were progressively widened from 3'6" to 5'3". And at that time, a number of the older station buildings were demolished and replaced. As you can see, this is just one representative example of station building at Kingston in the southeast. Again, there wasn't perhaps a lot architecturally to commend them, but they served the functional purpose quite effectively. I've included, this is one of our last everyone, just to contrast the development of one station through the decades. The top, this is all the photographs of Mount Lofty. We're up at the top, the summit of the South Line. Photographs taken in the 1920s. You can see the signal cabin here, perched up very tall so the signalman can see the track in both directions because the line sloped away from the summit at Mount Lofty, of course. The middle photograph is of the Victor Harbour, what was known as the South Coast Limited. It used to run on Saturday afternoons at a very fast pace behind a wonderful 520 class locomotive. And the bottom frame is in more recent times with a suburban red hen railcar in the photograph. We talked about magnificent follies, and this is perhaps one of the best. We have a representative from Port Pirie here, one of my close co-workers, Dr. Peter Carlin tonight. This was one of those amazing follies. I mean, this is the Ellen Street railway station, built was at a time when the trains literally ran down the main street. It's repeated in some other towns in Australia, but it's pretty unique to South Australian conditions. Again, thank goodness this building has been preserved and of course now houses the National Trust Museum in Port Pirie, looked after by Nancy Wood. Wonderful building, isn't it? Unique. There's nothing like it anywhere else in South Australia, and that's why I've included it. And we come, and I'm sorry about perhaps the quality of this photograph, but I guess it's sufficient for the purpose. The last significant construction of any note that relates to railway stations themselves would probably have to be Keswick in the 1980s. It took until 1984 for the standard gauge line to physically reach to Adelaide or to inner Adelaide itself. The line had reached the outskirts of town in 1982 and freight trains were running in and out by that stage in and out of Islington and Dry Creek. The passenger services using Keswick didn't come into being until July 1984. And so this is, as I said, probably the last that we will probably see as far as railway stations are concerned. And to close, I mentioned Mount Hope earlier. Well, there is Mount Hope, everyone. Again, you wouldn't want to miss that fortnightly train, would you? You have a long time to wait. I was privileged to grow up in an era where most of these lines and indeed stations are still open, thriving and working. Often people's first jobs would be found in the railways. You front up to the station master, put your name down, before you knew it you were taken on as a youth porter. And for many people it was the start of, they embarked upon a great and illustrious career in the railways from that point. Some very humble origins and beginnings and some amazing locations dotted throughout South Australia. Back when it was possible perhaps to rise through the ranks, probably through seniority and so forth, there were some amazing stories of people who had those humble origins and rose to amazingly senior positions within the railway. They were prepared to move, they were prepared to take promotion as it was offered, and they kept on moving. You had to, if you wanted to keep ahead of other people. Today the station master is no more. I challenge you to find a station master anywhere in South Australia. They don't exist. The nearest is someone who will be present whenever the GAN is at Alice Springs or at Port Augusta. They'll be there just for the duration of the train and be gone again. They're paid a casual rate. They're there just to be in attendance for the passage of that train and no more. There was a time when you started at the bottom rung as a Class 8 station master. Probably some out-of-the-way place in the middle of nowhere, but it was your start in a career. You moved through the grades, through from 8 to 1, and it wasn't over then because you then had special C, B and A. And even Adelaide wasn't special A. Port Adelaide held prominence. I think I'm right in saying Port Adelaide was the senior posting in South Australia. And if you looked at the spread of activity within the Port Adelaide area and the outer harbour and so forth, you could see why. The Gilman shunting yard, all the activity, it was just a hive of activity back in those days. It was a wonderful time to be alive, and there were some wonderful characters that came out through that whole process. I hope tonight, everyone, that I have, as I said earlier, rekindled some old memories, brought back things that had perhaps slipped from the mind, or introduced you to aspects about a slice of railway history from a social perspective that you perhaps haven't seen previously. So thank you very much, everyone, for having me.
I think you've all enjoyed that fine illustrated lecture. I'm sure that's brought up some questions that you'd like to ask, though.
Where is Mount Hope?
I'm sorry, where is...
Where is Mount Hope?
Oh, Mount Hope. Mount Hope is on the west coast. Let me... Now, let's just point out, in relation to Port Lincoln, the lady who asked, Mount Hope, you went up through Cummins to a place called Yolana, and you went west through to Pinning, and Mount Hope was the terminus just out. It's actually on the main road. The main road between Port Lincoln and Elliston goes through Mount Hope today.
Yes, to avoid the Mount Lofty gradients, they're talking of going through Angerson. Now, we're in Angerson, I couldn't see how they get from the height of Angerson down the Murray Valley plains below. I looked at Light Pass and that's didn't seem to be the place to go. How do they get from Angerson to the Murray Valley plains?
The history of alternative routes through the Mount Lofty Ranges goes back to the 1860s. If you're interested in that particular topic, I would commend a book authored by a chap named Roger Sallis, and it's called something like the Adelaide Hills, Railways of the Adelaide Hills. And Roger goes into some detail about the various options that were examined and surveyed back in the 19th century to look at ways and means of taking alternative routes through the Mount Lofty ranges. The issue with Angaston, of course, has come up in more recent times. There are two limiting factors that impede, the productivity and the revenue earning capacity of the line to Melbourne. One are the tunnels, and the other are the gradients in both directions. Now, there has been a lot of speculation, but I think it's been put to rest, the Angaston option. There was talk of going out, through basically following part of the old Sudan line, and then by various means coming into Angaston and actually tracking across and coming out somewhere around Malala. There are alternatives being looked at, however, in terms of putting in larger, more sweeping curves in the Callington area between Callington and Nairn. It's taking the top off the summit of Mount Lofty and doing, trouble is they can't do much work the other way. Tunnels are still going to be the problem. The engineering difficulties, and again there's been some very careful costing done on the various alternative options of getting up and over the Mount Lofty ranges. As I said, I think we're probably going to have to live with what we've got. The tunnels are going to be a limiting factor. Those of you who have perhaps seen trains that head north of Adelaide, the railways can put 2 and in some cases 3 containers one on top of the other, because there's little or no height restriction from Adelaide, from Islington to Perth, in fact. Where there has been height restrictions, the rail has been lowered under the bridge at Port Augusta and elsewhere. But heading south, of course, all those containers that are top loading all have to come off and go into their own separate vehicle, which does impede productivity quite a lot.
Perhaps I can have another question. There was a letter to the editor by C.A. Beach, South Brighton, in 1989, and he points out Ace Chapman, supervisor planning of the Metropolitan Electrified Rail System. Now this is very depressing to see what Adelaide could have got.
Yes.
He had plans tunnelling under King William Road and constructing a rail service to the eastern suburbs, and that's because the land's all sold, etc., etc. Now the Chippenham government provided finance, and large tracts of land were acquired by the Playford government, including land from Singapore to Brighton, etc. However, when it came to obtaining the necessary additional finance from the Menzies government, when Menzies won the election, the Premier was informed there were not enough funds available for such a bold plan. Now I just find this very depressing. We have an electrified rail system. Adelaide is the only city which hasn't got one, and it's just a missed opportunity. Any comment?
I think there's two things I'd say. One, if you want to see, there is one shining aspect on our rail system, our one concession to electrification. And you have to know your south line, everyone, to Belair. I'm talking about the Eden Hills Tunnel, and in particular the tunnel that brings the today's standard gauge interstate line through. If you look closely at that tunnel, it's been designed tall enough to accommodate the overhead wire of an electric train. It's our one concession in the state to electrification. Our dilemma in this state, and it's been with us forever, are two things. One is our population base and the lack of growth in this state. And secondly, we don't actually have the same sort of transport culture that people are obliged to adopt in places like Melbourne and Sydney. Now yes, you're right, had we in fact perhaps had the foresight of perhaps the authorities that Perth has shown, and to a lesser extent Brisbane, that of course now enjoy electrified trains, we'd be with the same status. But I think our dilemma is that we don't have sufficient numbers of people, yes, patronising public transport to make these sorts of things happen. There are times when, I'm in the tourism business, I would love to see Adelaide twice the size it is. So many things that are marginal today would suddenly become sustainable with a larger population base. But it's not today, and I think that remains a challenge for governments of today. Theo.
Thanks very much, John, for that presentation. It was very interesting, and the photos were very evocative of the bygone era of railways. Something a bit more up to date is the Darwin to Alice Springs Railway. I'm just thinking about the possible tourism benefits that will evolve from that. I imagine it was costed on freight rather than tourism, but I'm sure tourism will benefit significantly from that.
Yes, you're right there. I mean, any rail line today is costed on the benefits that will be delivered by virtue of freight haulage. Passenger traffic is really sort of cream on the cake in many respects. Great Southern Railway, to their credit, have already, foreshadowed their intentions in terms of extending their current Dan service beyond Alice Springs to Darwin. At this early stage, their intention is to run 2 return trains a week in what's known as the dry season, and the top end, which is basically sort of April through to about October, November, and that'll reduce to one return service a week north of Alice Springs in the wet season, which is obviously the balance of the year. However, bottom line is that it'll be freight rather than passengers that will sustain that operation. However, from Adelaide's point of view, of course, we will become even more importantly a significant hub for both north-south and for east-west long-distance passenger travel. We'll have services from Melbourne travelling through Adelaide to Darwin. We'll have services in Sydney travelling through Adelaide to Perth, and the various combinations in between. So that from Great Southern's point of view, they're going to need extra carriages, they're going to need extra staff, and I think it's testimony to the GSR that the bulk of their staff, in fact, are Adelaide and South Australian employed folk. And we are still, and will continue to be, their major hub and servicing centre for Great Southern's long-distance services, as well as the overland space as well. So, and certainly from a tourism point of view, it opens up significant possibilities in terms of linking South Australia with the centre, with the top end, with Kakadu and Litchfield, and also, of course, for people coming into from overseas, perhaps using Darwin as their gateway and coming south. One of the difficulties with the GAN at the moment is that there's surely imbalance in numbers. Far more people use the train north than do south. And I think this extension to Darwin is going to, in part, help redress that imbalance and perhaps have more traffic travelling in both directions.
Thank you. There is a proposal to have a new bridge over the Port River to carry a railway line.
Yes.
Is the Port Dock station going to have a new life?
No, Port Dock Station can't have a new life because, of course, it's a museum today, and it has been since 1988. The bridging of the Port River is designed to, I guess, take traffic off the commercial road viaduct, as we know it at the moment. It's really going to be designed principally for freight train movements that are heading at the moment to places like Pelican Point and some of the sidings that are on that western side of the Port River, heading up through Penrice products, the oil refineries and so forth, the oil depots and that sort of area. So it should be predominantly for freight traffic rather than, as I said, other forms of, certainly not for passenger trains.
This is the statement rather than a question, if I may. Last week I was in Grove Hill. You mentioned the small station south of Darwin.
Yes.
And I stopped in the pub for a beer.
Yes.
It's made of galvanised iron. It's about half the size of this hall. And a new proprietor is planning to make his fortune because the new rail's going right through. He understands that the new trains, of course, will go by at speed. But there'll be a lot of bridges built in the area, and he thinks there's 2 years of construction where he'll make his fortune. The other one I'd like to mention, if I may, my grandfather was a driver, and I never knew him, but I know a lot about him. And one photograph I have is on the footplate of the engine outside the Glenelg Town Hall. And the other one was that he used to drive on the Port Adelaide route, and my father said, at a faster schedule than they do today. That's probably because there were less stops. There were 2 points in his career which I remember. One was when he drove the lead engine on the Melbourne Express. And the other one was when he drove the Duke of York, who later became King George V, when he came to Adelaide on his way to open the new Commonwealth Parliament. And my grandfather drove him from Port Adelaide to Adelaide to stay with the governor. And I hold a certificate of thanks for the safe passage.
That's a wonderful. There's a wonderful example, I think, of oral history that literally reaches back, literally over generations. To be talking about the Glenelg Railway, not tramway. We're talking about the Glenelg Railway, which of course is pre-1929, at a time when there wasn't one but 2 railway companies that served Glenelg. One started from King William Road or Street and South Terrace, and the other from North Terrace, and they both went down to the bay. And on one of those particular stretches, there was the Theberton station. Fancy getting a ticket there. But Grove Hill, have you? Now, Ron, you shouldn't be admitting to that. Grove Hill has a wonderful history, and if any of you are travelling or find yourself in the Territory in the future, it's worth taking the detour off the Stewart Highway and going to Grove Hill and going to the Grove Hill pub. It will take you back in time. As it was in the 20s and the 30s, it was just tin nothing else to do on it, probably the original cobwebs were all over it. You just propped a bit of loose tin open with a stick, and that represented a breezeway. The concession is that they've got refrigeration on now, but it is right alongside the former railway line. It was an overnight stop at one point back in the old days, and it was the site of, it actually had its own tram branch line out to what was known as the Mount Eleanor Reef. It actually ran on an overbridge across the top. There are photographs exist of this amazing tramway that ran for several miles into the bush, and Grove Hill was the spot at which the ore was loaded onto trains down for Darwin. So if you're in the territory, make a point of going to Grove Hill. Brian.
Just a couple of Port Adelaide stories to add to the collection,
Yes,
John.
yes, Brian.
Just seeing the old Port Dock station reminded me of them.
Yes.
One is that the station crew used to play cards, and they just wait till they saw the smoke down the track because they were able to be up in that nice tower. When they saw the smoke, that meant they had to go down and man their post for the train to come in. The other was that in the early years, when there were, I think, 6 or 8 trains a day, about 1.5 hour intervals, so the loco drivers would go down and get in a bit of fishing by the Britannia Hotel between trains. So it's just a different era. And of course, there's quite a few people who are probably familiar with those wonderful instructions about the early trains, not leaping off the carriage to retrieve your hat if it blows off, which was printed in the register in 1856 when that line opened.
Yes.
So I wondered if you could throw in a few colourful stories for us before you depart. The best one I've heard was the East-West line, talking to an old timer in the Port Augusta pub. In 1973, he was the driver when he hit a camel going at 60 or more miles per hour. It was quite a mess by all accounts, as you might expect. And I'm sure there's a few more you could regale us with.
There are amazing, there is a fund of stories out there, Brian. You get railway men together and the stories really do start to flow. There are numerous stories told of, there were crews back in the old days who would, particularly the Depression years, would take a fire on a rifle with them in the locomotive. And the train would be travelling along, they'd be taking pot shots at whatever moved. And if they scored a hit, they'd actually stop the train, get out, go and retrieve their game, bring it back on the locomotive and take it home to mother. That certainly happened. There were others who were extraordinarily heavy drinkers on the one hand, and you had others who were extraordinarily teetotal. And often you'd get 2 of them on the footplate together and sparks used to fly. Many years ago here in Adelaide, I worked in the roster office, and we had a couple of people who didn't normally work together. Their surnames were Abbott and Costello. And the time finally came when they were rostered together. And the train controller of the day couldn't believe that we'd actually put these 2 fellows together. And there was an announcement I can recall, it was a passenger train heading to Bridgewater, and some wag, the man in blue or one of those, got on and said, the 517 to Bridgewater is being manned by Abbott and Costello. Well, it just brought the house down completely. But probably Ron Grant is probably better qualified than even I am to speak of that era and the colourful stories, some of which just don't bear retelling. I'd recommend just a bit of extra reading. There's a wonderful book, it's out of print now, but if you can get hold of it through the library, Patsy Adam Smith, who was the author of the Anzacs and other books on sort of the railway slant, wrote a book called Folklore of Australian Railwaymen back in the early 1970s. It's a collection of stories, yarns, tall tales and true, covering all of Australia, but there's a lot of South Australian content, particularly some of the early Commonwealth Railway drivers. I was privileged to be on the last of the old Dan trains out of Alice Springs in 1980. And sharing a compartment with me most of that way was a fellow who had driven the very first construction train into Alice Springs in early 1928. He passed on now, was an elderly then. And he had some wonderful tales to tell about those early construction days between Ugadata and Alice Springs. And most of the drivers and the crew from that era, all of them had or have stories to tell. From dining car stewards to porters, clerks, station masters, examiners, drivers, inspectors, you name it. I said earlier, there was this plethora of railway jobs. There was a job for everybody there. There was even, Ron may recall, back in the 30s, you could start work as what was known as a useful. That was your title. And you probably emptied bins and replaced carbon paper and receipt books or goodness knows whatever. We had in the railways, and Ron I'm sure can remember, a chap named Bill Watt, who's since passed on. Bill, yeah, Watt. Bill's sole purpose in life was to go around with eucalyptus oil, supposedly to sterilise the handsets of telephones. And the whole of the railway building reeked of eucalyptus oil. From the liberal application, the bill would come around every day, no matter what you said, no matter what your protests were, your phone was liberally applied with this eucalyptus oil, and because you pick it up and you have it on your ear, your clothing, everywhere. But he went down and he'd do his job, and everything we had this liberal application of eucalyptus. I can still smell it now. It was just remarkable. Yeah, Ron's quite right. A lot of her stories, in fact, are by people who worked on the, I'd mentioned earlier, the Port Lincoln division. Claude Simmons was one. Yes, that's right. He was a fitter, I think. Yes, that's right. There were this. Yes, it's devoted to the West Coast, where of course there's a lot of stories. What we've seen the passing of everyone, and again, probably this is for another time, but there is still waiting to be researched and written a social history of railway development in South Australia from a people point of view. Again, as I said earlier, I was privileged to be on the tail end and had the privilege of meeting a lot of characters. You start on this job today as a driver, and you'll be driving the passenger train within 5 years. When you started back in the steam days as a cleaner at Mile End or Peterborough or Mount Gambier or Tailem Bend, you aspired to joining what was known as the Cannonball Link. It goes back to Casey Jones' days in America. The Cannonball Link was the crack drivers, the express drivers who would drive the Overland, the Port Pirie Express, the Broken Hill Express, the fast interstate freight trains. It was, that's quite right. And those crews, including their firemen, on a steam locomotive would work from Adelaide Station to the border on a steam locomotive at night. Remarkable feat when you think about it. And those people were true artisans of their profession. There were good and there were bad drivers, good and bad engines. There were fast drivers and there were slow drivers, there were rough drivers and there were smooth drivers. Each of them had a character of their own. And they formed an elite group, particularly this Cannonball group, many of whom are still alive today. They were a very elite group, and drivers, you aspired to reach that pinnacle in the driving profession. Today you can almost sense when you've got perhaps a younger, less experienced driver handling a long train. You can feel it back in the train. People back in those old days took pride in the smoothness with which they started, controlled their train, and stopped right at the point where they had to put water into the engine tender. Those days have gone. What was a vocation in the profession is really just a job today, to be sort of got out of the way as quickly as possible. A lot of the romance of rail that we knew and enjoyed has really gone, unfortunately. I was saying tonight to some folks that if you were starting out as a rail enthusiast today, you can't travel in the footplate of a locomotive. There's no van at the back of a goods train. Trains don't shunt anymore. They're too fast for you to keep pace with. They just travel too fast. You get one photograph and you never see the train again. You can't catch it legally and stay within the limits. You did. You had to sign a risk note. That's quite right. But it gave you access to all the lines in South Australia. In the 1960s, I was part of a small group at St Peter's College who, at each holiday time, we would journey to a different part of the state on the back of a goods train. There were 5 or 6 of us. 2 have since died, unfortunately. But one has gone on to great heights, and that's Andrew Thomas. He and I shared an affinity with trains back in the 1960s, and he wasn't necessarily a high achiever at secondary school level. His time came later at a university. But during that era of the 60s, he and I and a small group of others would journey to all different parts of the state. I'm with the State Tourism Commission today, and I owe, I guess, part of my knowledge of the state to those early travels by train to Sevenard in the west, Coburn in the east, Alice Springs and Marie in the north, Mount Gambier and Millicent in the south. It's been a wonderful odyssey. As I said, you can't travel most of those lines today. They've all gone, been pulled up, and are now in part of history.
Well, thank you very much, John. I think we've run out of time for questions, so I'll ask Council Member Jim Loudon to come forward and move the vote of thanks.
Thank you, John. I'm sure it's been an enthusiastic audience, just as you've been an enthusiastic speaker. I'm delighted to hear how on top of the subject you were. There was nothing you didn't know, and without a note. I wish I could say the same. However, I have written on the footplate. I grew up in New South Wales, so I was learning a lot tonight about South Australian Railways. But as a youngster, we had a neighbour who was a driver on one of the South Coast trains, and I was on the footplate from Wollongong to Nowra and back again, and remember eating my sandwiches under the water tower at Berry. So I've had a lifelong fascination with trains. I'm sorry to see them go, just as you are, until I ride on one. And then when you ride on one and you experience the soot and the time it takes, you have second thoughts and think, well, perhaps modern trains have something to be said for them. Thank you very much indeed. I was saddened to be reminded of how much we have lost. I love the old buildings when I find them. I love the fantasy of Port Pirie and the old Dutch of Corn. I've seen these places, I'm delighted to say. I was intrigued about the assassination at Riverton. Most unlikely place, I thought, for an assassination. However, thank you very much, and thank you from all of us to you.